The morning of March 14, 1857 would eventually become one of the most whispered about days in Richmond's history, though few alive at the time could have guessed it as they gathered beneath the towering columns of the Richmond Exchange. The air carried the ordinary smells of tobacco and city dust, and the men who filled the portico came expecting nothing beyond another procession of human lives converted into profit. Yet before noon, a single sale would rupture every expectation of what a person could be worth, and why. According to state records, the winning bid translated to the modern equivalent of more than $370,000. The auctioneer's gavel had struck 17 escalating bids before the final offer froze the room, and 3 men collapsed outright, as if the logic of commerce itself had buckled. No surviving document explains how one human being commanded a value greater than entire plantations, or why the purchaser vanished into the mountains with his acquisition, leaving no trace in polite society again. What remained in the Commonwealth's archive was a ledger, leather-bound, ordinary at first glance, except for 7 carefully excised pages, torn so precisely that only faint bruises of ink lingered on the surviving sheets. Whatever story those pages once told was meant to remain hidden. But before we return to the sale that shattered Richmond's sense of order, we need you to join our circle of seekers. Subscribe, strike the notification bell so you never miss the histories they wanted buried, and let us know in the comments what city or state you're listening from. The map of our community grows one truth hunter at a time. Now let us walk back into that March morning, toward the moment when something impossible stepped onto the auction block. To understand why the sale became a wound in Richmond's collective memory, you must first understand the city itself in the final years before the war. Richmond in 1857 styled itself as the crown jewel of Virginia's commerce, its tobacco warehouses stretching along the James River like fortresses of prosperity. Elegant row houses rose along Church Hill, their occupants drawn from families who prided themselves on refinement, while the working poor crowded into the alleys near Shockoe Bottom. Behind the facades of order, more than half the people in the city existed without legal personhood at all. The enslaved, who toiled in kitchens, workshops, streets and fields, their presence essential yet deliberately uncounted. The Exchange building on Franklin Street stood as a temple of this economy. Its Greek revival pillars suggested permanence and civic virtue, though inside human lives were auctioned with the same brisk indifference as livestock or farm tools. Few men embodied this system more completely than Thomas Fairmont, the auctioneer whose mastery of the crowd could raise prices the way a conductor lifts a symphony. In more than 2 decades, he had conducted over 6,000 sales, each meticulously recorded in ledgers that catalogued not only physical attributes and skills, but also cryptic remarks, defiant eyes, scripture reader, likely agitator, notes that hinted at the humanity the market refused to acknowledge. The morning began without novelty. 10 enslaved field workers from a bankrupt Goochland plantation were offered in predictable sequence, their prices rising and falling in familiar rhythms. 80 men filled the auction hall, most of them merchants, planters, or traders who moved through these rituals with practiced apathy. Fairmont's voice carried its usual precision, rising at moments designed to coax additional bids, lowering when he wished to feign disinterest. Yet at precisely 11:47, the atmosphere shifted and the murmur of conversation dissolved as the side door creaked open. 3 figures entered. The first 2 were men whose boots and coats bore the mud and wear of long travel. But it was the third who halted the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Shackled at the wrists, she stood erect with a stillness so complete it seemed unnatural. Her skin carried the bronze of someone accustomed to harsh sun, but her hands, smooth, unscarred, conflicted with any known category of enslaved labor. She wore a plain cotton dress, her hair drawn back so tightly it sharpened the contours of her face. Her age was difficult to place, perhaps late 20s, perhaps mid-30s. What unsettled the onlookers most were her eyes, calm, unblinking, expressionless, as if she observed something beyond the room entirely. Even Fairmont faltered. He left his platform, spoke with her escorts, and examined documents they handed him. Observers later recalled how his face drained of color, then flushed, then drained again, as if the reality before him refused to align with what he read. At last he returned to his podium, clutching the papers with a stiffness those who knew him could not remember seeing. "Gentlemen," he announced, "the next lot is unusual." His voice trembled on the final word. He explained that the seller wished to remain anonymous, a right allowed under state law. The woman before them had been designated simply as Lot 37. No birthplace listed, no history of labor or training, no name. Predictably, irritation rose from the crowd. Why open bidding on such a cipher? Yet Fairmont pressed on, announcing the opening price, $5,000. The silence that followed was a suffocating thing. 5,000 exceeded the value of most entire families sold in Richmond. For a single woman with no documented skills, the figure was absurd. Shouts erupted, accusations of madness, of trickery. But Fairmont did not relent. Instead, he did something unprecedented. He opened the folder and began reading aloud the seller's sworn statement. The woman, according to the attestation, possessed knowledge of significant value related to agriculture, commerce, and territorial development, knowledge verified before a magistrate and 3 unnamed witnesses. The buyer, Fairmont said, would receive a sealed letter containing instructions for extracting this information. Forced questioning would be futile. Mishandling would carry consequences. The room shifted from irritation to dread. The auction floor, normally thick with cynicism, crackled with uncertainty. Then, a voice from the back, steady, mountain-worn, said simply, 5,000. The bidding began to climb, gaining speed like a runaway wheel. Merchants and planters competed, driven by greed and by the intoxicating pull of mystery. At 12,000, only 2 remained. At 15,000, the farmer's voice broke. At 20,000, the stranger in the wide-brimmed hat spoke with such calm finality that the room fell silent. No one counted. The sale of Lot 37 rippled through Richmond like a stone dropped into water, distorting every circle of conversation it touched. Within a week, speculation piled upon speculation, each rumor more elaborate than the last. Thomas Fairmont, usually a man of rigid routine, closed the exchange for 3 days, citing illness, a claim few believed. When he reopened, he refused to address the sale at all. Those who pressed him were politely directed to his attorney, whose only statement was that the transaction fully complied with Virginia law. Curiosity deepened after a clerk discovered the ledger entry for that day missing 7 pages, sliced cleanly away with surgical care. Only faint ghosts of ink remained on the adjoining sheets, traces of handwriting that no longer belonged to any visible text. Whatever had once filled those pages was meant to disappear. Richmond, a city already obsessed with its own mythology, was fertile ground for whispered theories. Some claimed the woman possessed information about lost treasure, Confederate gold, though the war had yet to begin. Others insisted she had stolen documents that could ruin entire families. A tavern keeper in Shockoe Bottom swore he heard her mutter in an unknown language, though he could never explain how he'd been close enough to hear her. Yet the theory that circulated most persistently concerned the sealed letter Fairmont had read from. According to rumor, the instructions described a ritual: darkness, isolation, questions posed in strict order. Only under those conditions, it was said, would she reveal hidden knowledge. Practical men scoffed, but the idea burrowed deep enough that its shadow lingered for decades. More chilling were accounts involving the 3 men who collapsed during the auction. One regained his senses quickly and fled the exchange. Another, a riverboat captain, retreated to his home and refused visitors for days. The third vanished entirely from Richmond society. Some claimed to have seen him later, wandering Petersburg with shock-white hair and trembling hands, unable to speak the woman's designation without shuddering. Whether these stories were true, or merely the city's imagination feeding on itself, no one could say. Richmond had always balanced uneasily between reality and superstition, and Lot 37 became a fault line where the two collided. 6 weeks after the sale, curiosity found its first serious investigator, Charles Whitfield, a reporter for the Richmond Dispatch. Known for his stubbornness, Whitfield had a reputation for sniffing out reluctant truths. He began with Albemarle County, seeking the magistrate whose seal had authenticated the sealed letter. Though the seal in the record books matched, the corresponding document had been filed in a restricted section that the clerk claimed Whitfield had no right to see. Pressing further, Whitfield found only closed doors and watchful eyes. Whatever the document contained, the county courthouse guarded it with unusual vigilance. Unshaken, Whitfield traveled to Staunton to examine the livestock company whose account had funded the $20,000 draft. The building listed as its address was an empty warehouse, boarded and chained, with padlocks bearing fresh gouges as though recently opened. Shopkeepers in the area offered contradictory stories. One claimed the property belonged to a Lexington land agent. Another insisted it was tied to a mining concern. One man refused entirely to discuss it, turning away when Whitfield mentioned the exchange. Each fragment seemed like a thread leading deeper into a web someone had deliberately designed. The trail went cold until late July, when Whitfield received an anonymous letter. No return address, elegant handwriting, a postmark from Westboro, a quiet town pressed against the Blue Ridge Mountains. The message was only 3 sentences. The knowledge she carries can redraw borders. Some boundaries exist only in the minds of men. Stop searching before you discover which kind you are. It was a warning disguised as a courtesy. Whitfield published what details he could in a short article on August 3rd, calling it The Mystery of the Richmond Exchange. Sensational enough to stir some local curiosity, but not enough to provoke immediate alarm. 3 days later, Whitfield failed to report for work. His room remained undisturbed, possessions untouched, bed made. There were no signs of struggle and no withdrawals from his bank account. The investigation that followed uncovered nothing, not a witness, not a trace. After 6 weeks, the search was quietly abandoned. Whitfield became one more vanished name connected to Lot 37. Time marched on, carrying the country into war. Richmond transformed into the Confederacy's capital, its streets choked with soldiers, supplies, and graves. The exchange building became a military depot, then fell into silence during Reconstruction. Paper records, ledgers, bills of sale, correspondence were packed into boxes and buried in a courthouse basement where mildew and dust became their keepers. Fairmont himself died in 1869, leaving behind a modest estate and a nephew tasked with sorting his belongings. Among them was a small iron box, his will instructed to be thrown into the James River without being opened. The nephew complied, though he later confessed the box felt too heavy to hold simple papers, as if filled instead with plates of metal or engraved type. Whatever secrets Fairmont locked inside it were consumed by the river. In 1873, a former Confederate officer named Daniel Vaughan published a wartime memoir. Most of the book recounted battlefields and hardship, but tucked in the middle was a brief conversation he claimed to have overheard in a Richmond hospital. 2 elderly men reminiscing about the past. One mentioned the notorious sale of 1857 and said something that caused Vaughan to write the words down. The buyer knew exactly what he was purchasing. He'd searched for her for years, would have paid $50,000 if needed. Some secrets are worth more than gold because they tell you where the gold is buried. The memoir received little attention, overshadowed by veterans' tales and a nation struggling to rebuild. But those few sentences would surface decades later, igniting the curiosity of someone uniquely suited to pursue the truth. Her name was Margaret Holloway, a historian known for excavating uncomfortable corners of Virginia's past. In 1891, while researching economic patterns before the war, she stumbled across Vaughan's remark. The figure, $20,000, stopped her instantly. She understood antebellum prices better than most scholars alive. She knew aberrations were rarely random. Something of profound value, social, economic, or otherwise, had been hidden behind that transaction. Her next step was Staunton, retracing Whitfield's path. The warehouse was gone, replaced by a hardware shop whose owner had no knowledge of earlier occupants. But Holloway followed the chain of property transfers through Augusta County records, discovering an odd pattern. The building had changed hands 7 times in less than 3 decades, with each owner residing in a different county. The final owner was a legal trust represented by an attorney who had quietly retired and vanished. Dead ends stood sentinel at every turn. Yet Holloway was not easily discouraged. While combing Albemarle County tax records in November 1891, she made her breakthrough. A land purchase, recorded in April 1857, 1 month after the exchange sale, listed an agent named J. Marlowe acquiring 240 acres in the mountains near Swift Run Gap for the astonishing price of $12,000. The property description differed from typical recordings. Instead of trees, fence lines, or creeks, it referenced geological markers, a granite outcrop bearing a survey mark, a limestone seam, a ridge aligned with coal-bearing strata. Whoever wrote the description understood geology intimately. Whoever bought the land had a purpose that extended far beyond farming. Holloway traveled to Swift Run Gap in December, accompanied by an aging guide named Samuel Fletcher. He surprised her by recognizing the property immediately. "That's the Marlowe place," he said. "Abandoned near 20 years now. Strange history there." When she pressed him, he explained his father had worked nearby and recalled when Marlowe arrived with a woman, built a cabin, and hired locals for digging work, always under strict rules. Only 2 men per shift. No speaking to the woman. Her role was to point. She identified where to dig, and whatever she indicated, coal, iron, limestone, appeared exactly where she claimed. "Never wrong," Fletcher said. "Not once." Holloway's pulse quickened. Margaret Holloway's return to Richmond in late December 1891 did little to quiet the storm of questions now occupying every corner of her mind. If the fragments she'd uncovered were accurate, the woman sold at the exchange had possessed geological expertise far beyond the reach of nearly all enslaved people, and indeed beyond most formally trained white scientists of her era. Holloway spent the following weeks combing through archives, letter collections, university records, and geological reports, certain that somewhere in the drift of forgotten documents she would find a thread that explained how such knowledge had taken root. Virginia's early geological surveys became her starting point. Many expeditions conducted in the 1840s had employed enslaved labor, not for scientific interpretation, of course, but for hard physical tasks, carrying rock samples, digging test pits, hauling equipment across rugged terrain. It wasn't impossible that someone observant, intelligent, and resilient could absorb far more than expected simply by proximity. Holloway's persistence finally paid off in the dusty back room of the Virginia State Library, where she uncovered field journals from an 1847 expedition led by William Barton Rogers, the geologist who would later found the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Rogers's journals were meticulous, filled with diagrams, notes on mineral strata, descriptions of weathered rock faces, but what arrested her attention was a brief, unassuming paragraph that seemed to vibrate with implication. Rogers wrote of acquiring additional help from a Negro woman, property of Colonel Thaddeus Hargrove, who, despite being unable to read, displayed uncanny ability in recognizing geological formations. Rogers noted her remarkable visual memory and her capacity to identify similar rock features across distant sites. Even more astonishing, he admitted she had accelerated their mapping efforts with her observations. Holloway reread the passage again and again, her pulse quickening with each pass. Here, at last, was a documented appearance of someone who might well have been Lot 37. Cross-referencing Rogers's notes with Albemarle County property records, Holloway identified Colonel Hargrove's plantation. Hargrove had died in 1853, leaving behind a modest estate and an inventory of enslaved individuals, listed only by age and general description, no names. None could be definitively identified as the woman Rogers had praised, but the timing aligned disturbingly well. If the mysterious woman of 1847 was indeed the same person sold in 1857, that meant she had acquired 10 years of real geological exposure, time enough for her to refine her natural aptitude into something approaching mastery. As Holloway dug deeper, she found 2 additional hints: an 1848 report referencing the Hargrove woman with geological aptitude, and a letter from 1849 in which a surveyor requested approval to hire an enslaved woman previously observed to be gifted in identifying mineral seams. Though no record confirmed whether she joined that expedition, the evidence suggested that her abilities were known quietly, discreetly, among a small circle of scientific men. Each fragment sharpened Holloway's belief that the woman had been deliberately exploited for her knowledge long before her infamous sale. Her research, however, was beginning to attract notice. In March 1892, Holloway received an anonymous letter, the handwriting cultured and deliberate. It stated bluntly, "If you seek the woman, I can give you her name. But know that knowledge demands payment. Cease your investigation and the truth will be offered freely. Continue, and you'll learn why some stories remain buried." It contained no return address and no instructions for reply. The message was both a lure and a threat, and instead of deterring her, it hardened her resolve. She turned her attention next to identifying the buyer. The name J. Marlowe, recorded in the Swift Run Gap purchase, was almost certainly false. Holloway requested access to banking records in Staunton for the months surrounding the sale. Her request was denied outright. She then attempted to examine tax records documenting who paid levies on the mountain property between 1857 and 1860. She was told those files had mysteriously been lost in a courthouse fire, strange considering that no other documents from that year bore signs of damage. It was becoming clear that someone, at some point, had gone to lengths to obscure all trails leading back to the truth. Then, in April, an elderly visitor arrived at her boarding house. His clothes were worn but once fine, and he introduced himself as Robert Dunmore, a retired mining engineer. He held his hat in trembling hands as he explained why he had come. "I was at the exchange that day," he said softly, "and I bid on her. Went to 5,000 before I knew better." Holloway invited him inside, sensing immediately that Dunmore carried the weight of something long suppressed. He told her his story in halting rhythm. In 1856, his mining company had hired day labor from various plantations. Among the men sent to dig test pits was a woman, sent by an owner who insisted she was more valuable than any field hand. Skeptical but curious, Dunmore allowed her to remain for the trial period. By the end of the first day, he understood why she'd been sent. "Miss Holloway," he whispered, leaning closer, "I have worked beside scientists trained in Europe's finest schools. I have advised mining firms from Kentucky to Pennsylvania. But I never met anyone, white or black, who could read the land the way she could." Dunmore explained that she studied ridges, soil color, vegetation patterns, the tilt of rock faces, and from these clues predicted mineral deposits with perfect accuracy. Not almost perfect, perfect. "She would walk a slope," he said, voice quiet with memory, "and point. Iron 20 feet down. Or coal seam run south beneath that ridge. We dug, and every time she was right." His company had tried to hire her permanently. Her owner refused, becoming defensive, frightened even, as if he understood how valuable she truly was. "Word got out," Dunmore continued. "Men in the mining business began whispering. Someone tried to buy her, I think. Someone with money and motive. And whoever that was, they ended up being the one who brought her to Richmond." When Holloway asked about the buyer, Dunmore answered without hesitation. The man who called himself Marlowe was James Pritchard, a speculator from Pennsylvania, a man obsessed with mineral rights. He would have paid $50,000 if he had to. 20,000 was a bargain. According to Dunmore, Pritchard had used the woman's abilities to locate and acquire dozens of mineral-rich properties, turning her knowledge directly into his fortune. Then Holloway asked the question she had been building toward. "Did you ever learn her name?" Dunmore stared into the middle distance for several seconds, his eyes glossy with memory. "No," he said finally. "Never once. But I remember the only words she spoke after the auction. She looked back at the crowd and said, 'You have bought knowledge, but knowledge takes a price beyond gold.' And then she walked out beside him." Holloway spent the following months assembling everything she learned, intending to publish the first comprehensive account of the exchange sale. But as she dug deeper, doors began to close. Archivists suddenly refused her access to files she'd previously been allowed to read. Correspondence she mailed to out-of-state universities never reached their destinations. On one occasion, she sensed she was being followed. By May of 1892, she abruptly abandoned the project. Her notebooks, containing everything she had uncovered, were stored away. She never researched another topic involving enslaved labor again. She died in 1903, leaving the mystery unresolved. Her notes remained untouched for decades, until 1947, when a graduate student discovered a rare memoir by William Barton Rogers, privately published in 1871. In an appendix discussing enslaved labor in scientific work, Rogers described a woman whose intellect surpassed that of many trained scholars. According to him, Colonel Hargrove's wife had secretly educated several enslaved women, teaching them not only literacy, but also scientific fundamentals from her husband's private library. When Hargrove discovered the transgression, he sold all but one, the woman Rogers later encountered. Rogers recorded that she spoke Latin with perfect pronunciation, and he recorded something else, her given name, Anna. This revelation propelled historian Thomas Edgerton to synthesize Holloway's notes, Dunmore's testimony, Rogers's memoir, and scattered historical fragments into a landmark dissertation. Edgerton traced Anna's trail beyond 1860. He discovered she had appeared in Pittsburgh as a technical consultant for a mining equipment firm, an unprecedented position for a black woman in that era. Through wartime loopholes, she legally purchased her freedom. For the next 2 decades, she operated as a private geological consultant, strategically undercutting the businesses of the very men who had profited from her enslaved labor. Then Edgerton uncovered the most striking episode of her post-emancipation life, her final encounter with James Pritchard. In 1869, unaware of who she truly was, he hired her to survey a new coal property. She provided a detailed assessment, reporting vast reserves of accessible coal. Pritchard invested his entire fortune on her guidance, and though the coal seam existed, it was tainted with sulfur so thoroughly that it was commercially useless. Pritchard was ruined. Anna, quietly, decisively, had taken her payment. By 1892, the year Holloway abandoned her research, Anna was still alive, listed in a Philadelphia business directory under a name that mocked her former owner, A. Hargrove, geological consultant. Edgerton's work revealed the final chilling truth. The sealed letter given to Pritchard at the auction was written by Anna herself. It read only 3 sentences. "This woman carries knowledge obtained by means forbidden by Virginia law. She will share it only with those who treat her with dignity and compensate her fairly. Fail in either, and the knowledge you gain will cost more than the gold you paid." The letter had been a warning, not instructions. A caution to whoever dared to claim ownership of her mind. The deeper historians dug into Anna's trail, the more sharply her story fractured the comfortable narratives Americans preferred to tell about their past. Her brilliance had not merely survived under oppression, it had flourished in defiance of it, slipping through the cracks of a social order built to suppress precisely such potential. Yet even Edgerton, who reconstructed her life with more clarity than anyone before him, acknowledged that the fullest truth remained elusive. Anna operated in a world that denied her legal existence, leaving behind no letters, no diaries, no first-hand testimony. Everything we know about her emerged from scattered fragments, men's journals, half-burned ledgers, county records, and memories spoken decades too late. But those fragments formed a portrait of a mind exceptional enough that even the rigid machinery of slavery could not entirely contain it. She had been exploited, bought, and sold. But she used every instance of exploitation to sharpen her skills, learning to weaponize knowledge in a world that insisted knowledge belonged only to white men. The Richmond exchange, where her fate momentarily became the spectacle of 80 onlookers, did not survive the decades. By 1953, the Greek revival structure, once a symbol of commerce and control, was torn down to make way for an ordinary parking garage. No plaque commemorates what happened on that portico. No marker mentions Lot 37 or the sale that defied the logic of the market. Thousands walk past the location today unaware that, on that ground, a woman's mind had been priced higher than the cost of entire plantations. The leather-bound ledgers, including the mutilated March 1857 entry, remain stored in the State Library, available only by request. The missing pages have never been recovered. Some archivists believe Fairmont removed them himself. Others suspect the exchange's board ordered their destruction to protect buyers and sellers with reputations at stake. Whatever the reason, the silence created by those vanished pages speaks more loudly than their words ever could. High in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the traces of Anna's work still linger for those who know how to look. Samuel Fletcher's descendants sold their nearby homestead in 1941, and logging companies slowly consumed much of the surrounding forest. Marlowe's cabin, if it could still be called that, collapsed into the earth long ago, leaving only a shallow depression beneath layers of leaves. Yet the sealed well shaft remains, its clay lining stubbornly resisting collapse. Hikers occasionally stumble upon it without understanding the purpose it once served. A cold, hidden vault where ore samples were stored like treasures. The 14 excavation sites she identified still form a jagged line stretching across the ridgeline, mapping underground mineral veins that brought fortunes to men who never knew her name. Geologists who visited the region in modern times confirmed that her predictions were not luck nor exaggeration. They were the work of someone with advanced spatial reasoning and a deep systematic understanding of Appalachian geology. After Holloway abandoned her research in 1892, she turned to other historical projects, avoiding any topic involving slavery or auction houses. Friends later said she'd been troubled in her final years by the sense that Anna's story remained unfinished, not because the facts were incomplete, but because the meaning was too vast, too unsettling. Her niece, who inherited her papers, donated them to the Virginia Historical Society with a note explaining that Holloway had stopped the project abruptly, as though she believed the story itself resisted closure. Holloway wrote only one line in explanation: "Some narratives do not end, they only deepen." Whatever shadow she encountered in her research, whatever pressure or presence warned her away, we will never know. But her hesitation adds one more layer to the mystery of Lot 37. Dunmore, the mining engineer who witnessed Anna's auction and briefly employed her in 1856, left behind a trove of handwritten notes discovered after his death in 1901. His children found them sealed inside a wooden box, each page documenting memories he had replayed across 4 decades. He analyzed her abilities, compared them with techniques practiced by professional surveyors, and revisited every conversation he'd ever overheard about her. In his final entry, written only weeks before he passed, Dunmore posed a question that echoed the uncertainty shared by many who encountered her legacy. Was Anna's ability supernatural, or was she simply a genius forced to disguise brilliance as instinct? Dunmore confessed he no longer knew. He had seen her predict geological formations with uncanny accuracy, yet he also knew that extraordinary skill could masquerade as magic when wielded by someone society refused to educate. Historians today overwhelmingly agree that Anna's abilities were rooted in intelligence, not mysticism, a combination of photographic memory, exposure to geological texts from Hargrove's library, years spent assisting survey expeditions, and an innate capacity for spatial reasoning likely produced her unmatched expertise. But the question Dunmore asked still lingers, not because scholars doubt the scientific explanation, but because Anna herself understood the power of ambiguity. She recognized that mystery protected her, but also empowered her. She allowed others to believe whatever they feared or desired, using the myth that grew around her to shield herself from the brutality of ownership. Those who underestimated her suffered financial ruin. Those who sought to control her discovered knowledge could not be owned, only borrowed, and sometimes repaid with devastating interest. What then should we make of Anna? A woman born into bondage, shaped by restrictive laws, denied formal learning, yet capable of rewriting maps and redirecting fortunes. Her story shatters the assumption that enslaved people contributed only labor to America's development. She contributed intellect, raw, formidable intellect that predated the institutions built to exclude her. Her knowledge enriched mining barons, powered the coal industry, and transformed mountain land once dismissed as barren into lucrative property. Yet she remained a ghost in the archives, mentioned only when a white observer felt compelled to record her value. The debt she spoke of, knowledge takes a price beyond gold, echoes across her life. For Pritchard, the price was financial ruin. For Fairmont, it was fear great enough to destroy pages from his own records. For Holloway, it may have been the realization that telling Anna's story meant confronting truths that unsettled polite society. For those of us who encounter her now, the debt is remembering her, not as Lot 37, but as a scientist whose genius defied a world determined to silence her. Anna's sites remain unmarked. No monument honors her, no school bears her name. But in the contours of the mountains, she read like scripture. In the seams of coal she located without error. In the scattered notes of men who tried to understand her, her legacy endures. The woman who was bought for $20,000, more than plantations, more than townhouses, more than the combined value of dozens of human beings, left behind something far more enduring than wealth. She left a challenge, to look at the forgotten, the ignored, the erased, and ask what brilliance lies concealed behind the silence of the historical record. So now, we turn to you. Do you believe Anna's gifts were learned through forbidden education, or do you think she possessed an intuition we still struggle to explain? What responsibilities do we carry in remembering those whose knowledge shaped history without ever earning them recognition? Share your thoughts below. And if this journey into the buried corners of America's past moved you, subscribe, tap the notification bell, and help this story reach others who seek truth where history tried to hide it.